The courtroom felt like time itself had frozen in place, like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. You could almost hear every tiny sound, the slow, steady ticking of the old clock on the back wall, the soft rustling of papers as lawyers shifted in their chairs, and the distant hum of cars outside the tall courthouse windows. Sunlight streamed through those windows, catching thousands of floating dust specks that hung in the air like tiny golden stars, making the entire room feel both silent and alive at the same time. Every single eye in the packed courtroom was locked on one person, the small, fragile figure sitting quietly behind the tall wooden witness stand. Her name was Mira, and she was only 9 years old. She looked even smaller sitting there, her legs dangling way above the floor because they were too short to reach the wooden platform under her feet. Her thin arms were wrapped tightly around an old, cloth-bound storybook, its corners frayed, and edges worn soft from years of bedtime readings that once brought her comfort. She held it as if it were the only thing in the world keeping her safe. Mira wasn't dressed fancy. She wore a simple, soft pink dress with tiny silver stars sewn across the fabric, the kind of dress a little girl might pick to feel braver than she really felt. But this wasn't a school recital where she might need that bravery. This wasn't even a nightmare she could wake up from. This was a real courtroom in a quiet Oregon town, and Mira was the youngest soul in a room full of adults, attorneys, clerks, a stern-looking judge, and her parents sitting on opposite sides of the room, each carrying mountains of blame, fear, and old wounds that no one could see but everyone could feel. Her mother was seated with her lawyer, her face lined with exhaustion but her eyes still fierce, clutching a crumpled tissue so tight it looked like it might tear. Her father sat far across the room, his body tense, arms clenched like he was trying to hold himself together, eyes fixed on the floor with a stare that was both empty and haunted. A heavy tension buzzed beneath the quiet, a kind of invisible current that made the air feel sharp and dangerous, like a storm waiting to break. But Mira wasn't looking at either of them. She kept her eyes locked on the aisle just beyond the wooden divider where, sitting calmly and perfectly still, was a large German shepherd named Axel. He wore a deep green vest with white embroidered words, "Service dog, do not pet." Though he looked relaxed, there was a quiet intensity about him, as if he was waiting for something only he knew was coming. And what happened next would change everything. Mira hadn't spoken a single word in over 18 months. Her silence hadn't come crashing down all at once. It had crept in slowly, like shadows growing longer as the sun set, until the soft sounds. She used to make little songs, gentle giggles. Bedtime questions disappeared one by one, fading like chalk drawings on a rainy sidewalk. It wasn't that she had nothing to say. It was because the last time she spoke, something terrible had happened, something that taught her words could be dangerous. And now, in this room full of people who were supposed to help, no one really knew the full truth. Not the attorneys, who whispered urgently to each other, not the uniformed bailiff who stood by the door, maybe not even the judge who had seen so many broken families before. But Mira's mother knew, and deep inside, hidden behind his tight jaw and clenched fists, her father knew too. That awful night started cold and dark. Mira's father had been pacing back and forth across the living room floor, his face tight, with anger simmering just below the surface. It felt like one wrong word or even a scared look could light a match to that anger. And then it did. One small mistake, one tiny moment, and everything exploded. Mira tried to run, her little feet slipping on the cold kitchen tiles. But he caught her and shook her so hard that bruises bloomed on her arms, and the world went black for a second. The bruises faded with time, but something inside Mira shattered. Completely, her voice, her sense of safety, her belief that adults could be trusted. Gone in an instant. After that, she didn't cry or scream. She folded in on herself like a turtle hiding in its shell, convinced that becoming invisible was the only way to stay safe. She stopped reaching for bedtime hugs, stopped asking for goodnight stories, stopped humming the little songs she used to love. It was as if the brightest, happiest part of her had vanished, and no matter how her mother called for her, it never came back. Therapists tried everything, endless therapy. Sessions where Mira colored circles with crayons, played with dolls, even tried different medications. But no matter what, Mira kept her lips pressed shut and her eyes fixed on the floor. It wasn't stubbornness. It was fear deep, powerful, and unyielding. Then came Axel. He wasn't introduced as some magical solution, but as a fragile lifeline. Something that might help Mira remember what safety felt like. The first day they met, she sat cross-legged on the soft carpet of her therapist's office, barely moving or blinking. Axel lay quietly across the room, his wise eyes watching her closely. He didn't bark or whine or beg for attention. He just breathed slowly, matching her quiet rhythm, as if he could hear the storm still raging inside her heart. Without any words or training, Axel seemed to understand Mira was special, that she was the one he needed to protect, the one who needed to know she still mattered. He was introduced as part of a trauma recovery program, but he became so much. More than that. At first, Mira couldn't even bring herself to touch him, afraid even of that small act. But Axel never left her side, waiting with endless patience, his gentle eyes saying more than words ever could. Days turned into weeks. And slowly, Mira reached out a shaky hand to rest on his thick fur. Months passed, and the smallest changes started to happen. A touch, a nod, a careful signal they had practiced in therapy. Axel wasn't just a comfort animal. According to her psychologist, he had become a living bridge of connection to a world Mira had completely lost faith in. And now, that bridge stood tall and silent only a few feet away, waiting for her to find the courage to cross. Judge Penelope Ward was the kind of judge who didn't usually soften. She had served more than 25 years behind the bench, presiding over countless divorces, custody battles, and courtroom dramas. Her reputation was crisp and cold. She followed every law to the letter, never let emotions sway her, and kept a courtroom tighter than a drum. Many respected her, some feared her. None underestimated her. This morning, she sat upright in her backed chair, silver glasses perched at the tip of her nose, black robe perfectly pressed, hair pulled into a severe bun that made seasoned attorneys sit up straighter just by looking at her. But something was different today. When she looked at Mira, she didn't see just another case file or statistic. She really looked at her the way the little girl's hands were clutching her book like a life raft, the stiff set of her shoulders, her feet dangling far from the ground. And then Mira's eyes flicked, just for an instant, toward the back of the courtroom, toward the dog. Judge Ward followed her gaze and saw Axel sitting motionless behind the barrier. She had allowed the service dog in court after reading pages of psychological evaluations, but she hadn't truly expected to see the power of that decision until this moment. A girl held together by silence, a dog holding the space she needed to find her voice again. The judge leaned forward, just slightly, her voice softening so much that it made everyone in the room take notice. "Mira," she said gently, I need to ask you something. You don't have to answer with words if you're not ready. You can nod or shake your head or look at Axel will understand. Mira didn't move at first. The silence stretched so long it felt heavy enough to crush the room. No one dared to break it. The attorneys sat frozen. The court reporter's fingers hovered inches above her keyboard. Terrified even the smallest keystroke might ruin this fragile moment. Mira stayed perfectly still except for her hands. Her left hand clutched the worn spine of her storybook so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then, slowly, her right hand lifted, trembling just a bit, and traced a small, careful circle in the air with her pinky, so tiny and soft it looked like a secret only one being in the room would ever understand. Axel did. The German shepherd's ears twitched, and he rose in one smooth, graceful motion, not rushed or sloppy. Every movement precise and confident, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. He walked he strode through the small gate beside the witness stand. The bailiff shifted, ready to intervene, but the judge raised a hand to stop him. Everyone watched in breathless silence as Axel reached Mira's side, turned and sat firmly next to her, eyes scanning the courtroom, as if standing guard. He was calm, silent, and strong. Mira then tapped her chest once, twice. Axel barked once, a single sharp sound that cut through the air like a bell. Bark short but clear, and that was it. Arapal passed through the room. Like Akil, people looked around confused, but moved. The attorneys turned to Onenatha, whispering. The court clerk blinked rapidly. Mira's mother, Avrida, mouth with both hands. Judge Ward sat upright. Her hands folded, her expression unreal, but her eyes searched the girl's face as though decoding a message written in invisible ink. What does that mean? She asked without looking away, her voice low but direct, and from the back of the courtroom someone stood. It was Mira's psychologist. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly. That's a communication sequence we developed, she said. Mira and Axel practiced it for months. It's how she tells the truth. She's too afraid to speak out loud. The judge didn't speak right. Awaish blinked once. Slowly her gaze shifted from the psychologist to Mira, then to Axel, still seated. Like a soldier on Detarth room held its breath. Deaf psychologist stepped forward, carefully holding something in her hand, a small cream-colored envelope, slightly bent at edges. She gave me this yesterday, she said gently, her voice carrying through the silence. She told me only give this to the judge if Axel barks. Judge Ward reached for the envelope, her fingers steady but her eyes unspitonish, opened it, slowly peeling back the flap as though it contained something sacred, and in a way it did. Inside was a drawing done in crayon but precise in its pain. It showed a small girl and mystically Mira crouched in the corner of a room, her arms wrapped tightly over her head. Looming over her was a man, tall, red-faced, twisted in anger, his hands clenched into fists. His mouth opened in a silent roar. In the corner of the picture stood Axel, positioned between the man and the girl, his body low, defensive, his mouth open mid-bark, his eyes sharp and watchful. Thick was still, but something invisible shifted. Judge Ward stared at the drawing longer than anyone expected. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her throat moved as she swallowed hard, fighting the sting behind. Her eyes Shahad ruled on hundreds of cases, but none had ever looked her in the face like a thirst through a child's truth. Drawn in broken lines and bold crayon, she Neth, drawing over on the back, written in uneven block letters with a blue marker where 9 simple words. He says, he cares but I only feels safe when he's not there, gasps swept through the gallery. Fether stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. This is absurd that dogs Tranesh. Could have sit down, Judge Ward snapped. Her voice no longer soft, it cracked through the silence, like a lightning strike, or I will have your moved. The father froze. Axel didn't move. Mira didn't flinch for a moment. No one moved. Judge Ward placed the drawing on the bench with deliberate care, Osto afraid even a breeze might tear it. Her fingers lingered on the paper, tracing the edges like it was something living, something fragile. Her eyes flicked to Mira, then back to the words, written in uneven letters. He says, he cares, but I only feel safe when he's not there. It wasn't evidence in sense, but it was more than thought. It was a child's raw truth, unfiltered by adult logic or legal argument. And in that courtroom, with all its formality and rules, that truth hither than anything written in a report. Father remained standing, face with anger, chest heaving. She's manipulating you, he barked, pointing at Mira. She's using that dog. This whole thing is coached. Judge Ward didn't even blink. This court, she said coldly, does not take well to intimidation. You may sit, or you may be escorted. Out his mouth append, as if to argue, but the baif tuka. Single step forward, the father said. Silence returned. Axel remained perfectly still, his gaze locked forward, but his body leaning ever so slightly into Mira's leg, a silent reassurance. I'm here, and Mira Shea hadn't moved, not even flinched through her father's outburst, but there was a mething different. Now her shoulder-sins, hunched inward, seemed to shift, just slightly, like a weight had been lifted, and then, with the softest voice the room had ever heard, Mira spoke. Axel no shoe keeps me safe. She said her remembers everything, even when he couldn't. The words didn't echo, they didn't need to. The weight of them settled into every corner of the room. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. For a long moment the room remained suspended, caught between breath and disbelief. The sound of Mira's voice, soft as it was struck like thunder, not bow, 'cause it was loud, but because it existed. After 18 months of silence, the courtroom had been witness to a miracle. Quiet but seismic. Judge Ward didn't hide her reaction. She blinked several times, as if making sure she had truly heard the words. She leaned forward, both elbows resting on the bench, fingers clasped together. Her sternness had not vanished, but something else had appeared beneath it, reverence. Mira, she said gently, thank you. Those two words hung in the air like a blessing. Axel still sat at Mira's side, unmoving, but his ears twitched at the sound of her voice. He leaned a little closer, brushing her arm with the side of his body. It was a small gesture, but it grounded her. Mira's eyes didn't stray to her father, not once. She didn't flinch when she heard his breath catch, or when his hands skirled into fists against the table. Her gaze remained forward, her focus unwavering. She had said what she needed to say. Judge Ward turned her attention. Shanto, Mira's mother, whose tears now fell freely. Her lawyer rested a reassuring hand on her back, but the woman hardly noticed. Her entire being was fixed on her daughter, with awe, with sorrow, with pride, and with heartbreak, because in her daughter's voice she could hear, through it, of every sleepless night, every bruise left unseen, every scream that had gone silent. It was the sound of pain that no mother ever wants to hear spoken, it in volume, but in truth. Ma'am, Judge Ward said, voice steady, I am granting you full custody of your child. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no applause, just a quiet collective release, like the building had been holding its breath with everyone else. And finally the father opened his mouth again, but this time the bailiff stepped forward and shook his head. Nothing needed to be said. The judge's Gabelman Dantok. It wasn't over, not yet. The work was done, the testimony had been heard, though only a few words were spoken. The evidence lay in crayon on the judge's bench, and yet what lingered most wasn't what had been shown or said, it was what had been felt. Judge Ward gathered her files with practice-adration, stacking them neatly before her. The room had settled, though no one had quite returned to normal. Something unspoken had passed through the space, something sacred, and no one wanted to break it. Her hand hovered above the gavel, poised to bring the session to a close, but she paused. Her eyes moved from the mother quietly weeping in gratitude to the father sitting rigid and defeated into mirror, still seated on the witness stand, Axel steady by her side, the book in her lap, now resting slightly open. The judge looked directly at the child, and for a rare moment in her long career, her voice wavered. You've said more with a single signal than most adults say in 1,000 words. She whispered. She wasn't speaking as a judge then, but as a human being, one who had just seen something that pierced through every layer of legal training, protocol, and restraint. Judge Ward lowered her hand and, instead of bringing the gavel down with force, she set it on the bench, forcefully, not in judgment but in awe. Then, without another word, she stood and left the bench, and the room stayed silent. Because there was nothing more to say. 6 months later, in a different kind of silence, this one filled with peace, the sun was warm on the park bench. That afternoon leaves fluttered lazily in the breeze, casting moving shadows on their notebook that lay open across mirror slab. Her small fingers held a color-red pencil, carefully sketching a scene: trees, birds, and a dog that looked very familiar. Axel lay curled beside her, his eyes half closed, but his ears alert as ever. He didn't need to watch her constantly anymore. She wasn't broken, now just healing, slowly, steadily. Mira still didn't speak much, but she didn't need. Tosh laughed. She drew, she made eye contact. She had begun to sleep through the night. Her therapist said it was progress. Her mother said it was a miracle. A little boy wandered over from the playground, his hands sticky with ice cream. He stopped a few feet away and pointed at Axel. Can I pet your dog? Hissed. Mira looked up, the corners of her lips lifting. She didn't answer right away. For a split second, her fingers switched with hesitation. A trace of dagger who once disappeared inside. Silence, but then she set her pencil down, closed her notebook, and gently tapped her chest. Axel gave a single, friendly bark and wagged his tail. The boy laughed, and then so did Mira, a real laugh, the kind that caught in her chest and spilled out like sunshine. Not just sound, but life, the kind of laugh that told the world she was still here, that the bridge was working, that healing had begun.